Ah, Security Breach. Nearly every FNAF fan's dream game. Perfect lore, seamless storytelling, meaningful and coherent gameplay, and a simple to follow along story, right? Well, wrong. Personally, I really did enjoy the aesthetic of Security Breach, and I loved the animatronics. It actually felt like a place I'd want to visit, rather than the old decrepit pizzerias. But this game is far from perfect, and this version we actually got was completely different to what Scott, the creator, wanted. I mean, completely. Scott intended a completely different story than the one we got from Steelwool, and that's because Scott only gives Steelwool snippets of information and expected them to fill out the game themselves, creating the lore themselves. He confirmed this in an interview with Dorko where he said he gave them sprinkles of puzzle pieces and realized that was completely wrong, because he ended up with a product which didn't fit his vision or the lore he wanted to create. I mean, you only gotta look at Security Breach's cut content and it'll tell you how much of a mess it was. Vanny was supposed to be the main villain, we were supposed to have an overarching story with this voice which we heard in the trailer.
You will do as I say. You will bring me what I want. And if you fail me, then you will. Both of you burn!
All the puzzle pieces scattered throughout, which seemingly make no sense. Burn Trap being in there, but then later disappears in ruin. So what was the original story? What was he trying to tell us? Well, I'm going to solve this game the way Scott Cawthon always wanted it to be solved and give us the story which he intended to tell. Because immediately you would have noticed throughout the gameplay how certain things don't seem to add up or join together in the storytelling. A prime example here is when Vanessa grabs Gregory and Gregory all of a sudden just blacks out or faints and then wakes up in Lost and Found. This is not explained throughout the story at all, and we're left guessing as to why Gregory seemingly faints and how it's never mentioned again throughout the story. Oh, this isn't the only example, there are several others throughout Security Breach. I mean, we see Moon dragging Freddy off somewhere. This is never explained. We have a complete replica of Mike's room from Sister Location, just in the Pizzaplex. The table with staff bots dressed like some type of family. We then have the issue of several different endings, and some of these endings would literally mean it renders all of the lore throughout Security Breach completely useless. So why are they even in the game? And I haven't even spoke about Burn Trap yet, the big issue, the burning issue in the room. But don't worry, I'm going to cover all these in sequence so it makes sense. You see, we're never going to know the actual clues Scott gives Steelwool. All we know is that it didn't turn out the way Scott envisioned at all, and he was completely disappointed. And he blamed himself because of lack of communication, and rightly so. I mean, you can't expect a developer to develop a game when you give them literally 5 sentences. But what we can do is kind of piece together a story now based on the games which is released after Security Breach. Because as Scott always does, he tries to solve his previous games with the next game. And as we know, with Security Breach, we had Ruin, and it kind of told a different story. Glitch Trap was seemingly completely gone, Burn Trap was seemingly completely gone and replaced with the Mimic, and other elements throughout the story, again, were completely gone. This is because Scott Cawthon identified that for the story to be told correctly and coherently, he needed to be hands-on once again. So during Ruin's development, he was far more hands-on, more communicative, if that's even a word, and actually gave Steelwool the input they needed. And this is why I believe Burn Trap was cut completely and replaced by the Mimic. Scott had come in and rectified the entire situation here. But that doesn't solve Security Breach or solve any of the storytelling throughout Security Breach. I mean, it doesn't answer why Gregory blacks out, it doesn't answer why Freddy all of a sudden found himself in the hole, or why pieces of several different endings are present throughout Ruin, indicating that multiple endings are now canon. But fear not, fellow FNAF theorists, because we've got it covered and we're going to answer it ourselves. And we're going to use the clues found throughout Security Breach, which are the ones I believe Scott gives Steelwool to put in the game. And I'd like to kick off with one of the biggest mysteries in Security Breach, and that is Mike's room. You see, throughout Security Breach, we come across literally the one-for-one replica of Mike's room, the exact same one we see that he goes back to in Sister Location each night. This, to me, has Scott written all over it. This is one of the clues he gave to Steelwool, but clearly they didn't know what this meant or what to do with it. So the answer came in Ruin. Like I said earlier, Scott answers questions from previous games in his new game, which was Ruin. Now at the very end, you hear Gregory giving Cassie directions to leave the underground network when she's being chased by the Mimic. And this is where you hear Gregory say this.
Just follow instructions.
That right there is a one-syllable word. Now that right there could indicate follow his direction, but they specifically cut out that word because it's a name clearly. And that right there, I believe, lines up with what Scott wanted to tell. And that story is that Mike is still alive. Follow Mike's direction. You combined it with Mike's room in the security breach playthrough. Mike is very much alive, and Scott wanted people to know that. Steelwool just didn't do anything with it. I mean, Gregory even literally says this person has detailed floor plans, and if Mike was hiding out in the Pizzaplex in this room, of course he would. That's clue one, that Scott is kind of following his old traditions. Hauntings, past characters, cycles being repeated? Well, let's continue, because now I'd like to talk about the sticky note room. You know, the one where we have like binary code, children's drawings, and as if someone was hiding out in this room. Not only that, we also have the room with the staff bots dressed up as some type of family. This is one of the bits of information I believe Scott Cawthon gave Steelwool to put into the game. Just got Scott written all over it. It's just out there in the middle of nowhere, basically, and makes no sense, right? Because it doesn't make sense to the story Steelwool were telling, but it makes sense to the story Scott wanted. You see, it's quite obvious from this room that it's some type of young individual or young machine coming to terms with its own existence. Now, we all know the popular game theory, the Greg bot, and they believed it to be Gregory. That isn't true. I don't think Scott intended Gregory to be some type of machine, but either way, someone was in this room learning of their own existence and wanted a family of some sorts. Hence why the staff bots were there in some type of arrangement around the table to signify some type of family. And the sticky notes also tell a similar theory here. You see, that binary code sticky note translated actually translates to why is I? Again, confirming it's something coming into its own existence, asking why is it even alive? Now, looking at the dismantled staff bot heads, you could say that it could be a staff bot coming into its own existence. I mean, sentient, right? I mean, also the animatronics, the glamrocks, they also kind of seem like they're sentient, although we know it's programming, an advanced program. And the same could be said for the staff bots, so I don't believe it to be a glamrock or a staff bot. What machine do we know which was learning, mimics behaviors, and potentially starts to become sentient? That's right, believe it or not, the Mimic. And I know it sounds crazy that Scott intended the Mimic as early as Security Breach. Well, perhaps he actually did. That was his intention, although Steelwool didn't execute it. Steelwool could have believed that it was an Afton enemy of some sorts. This would explain why the Afton voice was cut from the trailer, why they then cut out Burntrap because people were thinking it was Afton inside of this endoskeleton, and why Scott replaced Burntrap with the Mimic in Ruin. We also see other hints throughout Security Breach, such as notes on walls saying it's drawn to sound. Now, looking at the new Secret of the Mimic game, we know we have some type of Faz wrench, which has a sound luring capability, as well as they use wind-up mice to throw, make a sound, and lure the Mimic that way. Again, showing in Security Breach, something was drawn to sound. Now, you could say again that was a glamrock animatronic. We know Chica was drawn to sound. And for me, Scott Cawthon's entire franchise was based on the paranormal, supernatural, but Security Breach seems to be focused more on technology and a digital world. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to that, but it seems a far fetch away from where the franchise began. And that's because Steelwool's interpretation was moving more to the digital world, right? But Scott still wanted to keep it grounded in the paranormal, and that is why I believe his original story wasn't one of Burntrap. We know this. It was one of the Mimic, and he was building up to that all along, as well as bringing back key characters such as Mike and also Henry. And if you've seen last week's video, you'll know that Henry is still alive. Whether he's in the blob or not is another question, but all of this was planned by Scott, but just not executed correctly with Steelwool. And believe it or not, how the Mimic was and is supernatural in itself. I mean, have you ever thought if the Mimic was trapped down there for 30, 40 years below the Pizzaplex from 1979 to 2030, whatever it is, 50 years even, how he still has power? That must be some pretty good technology in the 1979 to power an animatronic for 50 years. That's because it isn't powered. I believe the Mimic was possessed. And I've talked about this in past theories as well, but I'll continue on that later. Let's continue with more hints through Security Breach. You see, I always found it odd how Scott's storytelling shifted apparently from the supernatural hauntings and repeating cycles to this new digital conspiracy. It just didn't seem to fit in Security Breach. And then I realized he didn't switch. He didn't create the game. He gives Steelwool tiny bits of information to create it for him. And thus we ended up with a different story, not Scott's intended story. Scott didn't switch from hauntings and supernatural to this digital world. It was always there. Steelwool did. By mistake. You see, they wanted to follow the old William Afton route and thought the only way they could get him into this game is by him somehow coming back through the digital world. They didn't realise that Scott wanted to move on and have a new villain. Hence why in Ruin, Burntrap's completely gone and replaced by the Mimic. It was Scott's intention all along. And how Freddy and Gregory were literally fighting an evil. That evil was going to be the Mimic all along, rather than Burntrap. The Mimic is now the overarching villain. Again, Steelwool thought the overarching villain was going to be William Afton, hence that voice in the trailer. The issue here is though, because Security Breach was built with a different vision, some of it just doesn't line up with the Mimic theory at all. I mean, how could this sticky note room be inhabited by the Mimic when the Mimic is now downstairs buried beneath the Pizzaplex? We obviously have a very clear answer how the Mimic could be possessed, literally by Edwin's son, David. We know David was hit by a van, but that could easily be a cover story just like in Sister Location where they closed it due to a gas leak. That wasn't the case, they closed it because Baby literally ate Elizabeth. And the same thing could be said for the Mimic. The Mimic could have literally mimicked Edwin, stuffing endoskeletons inside of these mascot costumes. The Mimic did the same to David, and unfortunately killed him. It would also explain why we see flesh inside the TigerRock plush. It would also explain why in the books, Edwin apologizes to the Mimic and says he's sorry. He's not apologizing to the Mimic, he's apologizing to his son who's inside the Mimic. And because obviously the Mimic is an animatronic, it's still bound by his programming, exactly like all the other animatronics in the FNAF games. Yes, they're possessed, but they still follow some of their programming. Scott hasn't moved away from the supernatural roots, they're still there. Steelwool just created their own story because they didn't have enough information, hence why they went this Burntrap route. This was then remedied when Scott came back on board in Ruin, and hence how we're having this whole story now about the Mimic, how it got to be. It's going to move us back into this supernatural hauntings route. And then if you think about it, the Mimic could then literally be the male equivalent of Baby. It then also explained why the Mimic seemingly asks for ice cream to his father Edwin, because that's something David would have done, right? Sure, you could say he was literally mimicking David, but wouldn't it make more sense that the spirit of David was inside the Mimic, asking his father for the ice cream, but then to be violently beaten? It's that tragic undertone that Scott would tell. We also know that the Mimic has infested and corrupted the systems in the Pizzaplex. You just gotta look at Helpy in Ruin. Helpy is literally the extension of the Mimic. It's literally getting Cassie to turn off all the security nodes and unleash the Mimic, showing us that the Mimic was always in the Pizzaplex's systems from the start, the one corrupting all the animatronics. It wasn't Burntrap or a glitch trap, it was the Mimic 01. This would then explain in Security Breach why the animatronics are acting out, why they're going against some of their programming, why some of the staff bots are potentially glitching out as well. The Mimic is infesting the systems. So Scott's vision was there to a degree, but not told very well. This makes sense as why now they're trying to build the Mimic into literally everything before Security Breach into the box. It's now Glitch Trap / Mimic 01. They're trying to build the Mimic into it rather than this Glitch Trap, Burn Trap, because they have to. They're kind of now having to rejig the story which Scott wants. And again, that's all on Scott, nothing to do with Steelwool. But the issue is here, when you try and play Security Breach and try and think of this story in your head, nothing seems to match. Sure, some things will, like the room, obviously we could say the Mimic was in there, but then that won't match to why the Mimic's below in the Pizzaplex. Sure, I've come up with plenty of theories of how that is possible. The Mimic was in this room, then was transferred to the holding cells we see in Parts and Service. I have a whole theory on that, but again, that's me trying to fit Scott's interpretation with Steelwool's, so it's very hard. But what we've done today is try and solve Security Breach the way Scott would want it to be solved, and that is Burntrap never existed, it was always the Mimic, and how certain things did always point us that the Mimic was around. We were just never really shown it. Well, until now. And who knows, maybe Afton will come back, because he always does come back, right? So what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below, and hit that like button. It does really help me out so much. And if you want to see more from me, hit subscribe, because there's plenty of videos on the channel and answers to questions I've even asked in this video. So please go and check out all my other stuff. Massive thanks to my members who are on screen now, the security guards in the Pizzaplex, with a special mention to Lauren and Penguin Lover 12. And as always, I'm Twisted Animatronic. Stay safe out there, superstars.